Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our second webinar of the Energy of Futures webinar series. Today, I'm super happy to discuss the topic with you and our guest, Empowering Change, Lessons from International Energy Communities. My name is Hannah Braun. I'm a campaigner with Attack Austria, and I will be moderating the first part of today's webinar. So why are we doing this webinar series at Attack Austria? We've been discussing and campaigning for energy democracy over 2 years now. And we've also been co-funded by the European Union and an Erasmus project called Empowering Energy Democracy, a holistic educational program, where we aim to have more discussions about a fossil fuel-free future and also discuss the topic of energy democracy in broad with new people and people who are already experts. So our objective is to raise awareness and further educate. And also, this is why we invited an expert today, Rowan Mataram from the TNI, which I think she will introduce herself in a second. Just for organizational purposes, I'm just going to tell you some side facts about today's webinar. So we're going to have an input session and you will be able to ask questions afterwards. You can either ask those questions by raising your hand and directly asking them, or put them in the chat. If you put them in the chat, just be sure that your formulation is clear, and you if you see other questions that you find interesting, just vote them through an emoji reaction. Our volunteer, Victor, who will introduce himself in a second, will then moderate the questions in the second half. So Victor, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
My name's Victor, and I'm a volunteer with Attack. Yeah, I've been volunteering for a few months now, and yeah, I'm very excited to join you guys on the for this presentation.
Thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rowan, and thank you for being here. We're looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Hello, thanks very much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully get the right one. Yeah. Okay, great. Can you see that okay now? I somehow can't see the Zoom. Okay, cool. Okay, so thanks very much for having me. My name's Rowan Mataram and I work at the Transnational Institute with a focus on the energy transition and also public services more broadly. Just a note as well, if anybody finds that I'm talking too fast, please let me know, maybe with a sort of hands down emoji, which in the so I can see your, because I can kind of see people, but I can't see the chat. Great. So in Europe, energy communities usually refer to the coming together of different constituents or communities to collectively fund and or provide an energy service. So for example, energy generation or energy efficiency schemes. But for this presentation, I'm going to take that definition quite loosely to explore how energy projects are being run at the multiple scales, and this includes state, municipal, community and cooperative, that are needed for the energy transition to be delivered effectively and democratically. So at TNI, we've been researching public services, including energy, for many years, and we particularly focus on ownership and governance. So when applying this to the big picture, it's looking at how the energy transition can be more participatory and accountable whilst being efficient. So to briefly situate this within the wider context of the energy transition, it is well studied that reducing emissions from our energy systems is one of the most important ways that we can slow further climate change. And this is why the energy transition has been a core focus of policy across the world for several decades. Yet last year, we passed the 1.5 degrees of warming that such policy action has been trying to prevent. Emissions from fossil fuels were at an all-time high, and energy from renewables, whilst increasing, is progressing far slower than we need. So as part of our work, we examine why this is happening, and we've developed the public power files to kind of unpack this for public consumption. And these pieces really aim to understand what is preventing the transition from taking place, as well as showcasing examples from all over the world about how the transition can be delivered. So one report that you might find useful is called the Energy Transition Mythbusters. And this report highlights the common policy myths that are inhibiting a just energy transition. So to give an example, one such myth is that the falling price of renewable energy makes decarbonisation inevitable. when in fact, due to increases in energy demand alongside the stranglehold that the fossil fuel industry has over energy policy, the rise in renewables is also being accompanied by a sharp increase in fossil fuel consumption. And it also doesn't consider the emissions that are from accessing resources for renewables. And you can see on this slide that there's the 6 different myths that we unpack in that publication. So our next publication that you might find useful is Green Multinationals Exposed. And this report dives into 15 of the major green energy companies and how they've hijacked the energy transition for their own profits, as well as how they're consistently undermining efforts to decarbonise the economy and ultimately replicating the same environmental and human harms from our fossil fuel-based energy system onto the renewable energy system. So, for example, the sites of extraction from primary energy resources in both fossil fuels and renewables have many reports of human rights violations for workers, as well as damages to the environment. And if you're interested in this report, it goes into several cases in a lot of detail, and you can find it on our website. So, our most recent report, Reclaiming Energy, we reiterate that the privatisation logic underpinning many transitions is simply not delivering the energy transition at the speed we need it to happen. So we focus on bringing together examples from across the world that show alternative approaches are not only possible, but are happening in every continent. And in fact, 9 out of the 10 countries leading the transition to renewables have strong public energy companies at the core of their energy systems. In our report, we also highlight the need for an increase in government coordination across scales to develop nationwide systems that enable the energy transition to happen at the speed we need it to tackle climate change. Community energy projects alone will not be able to decarbonise whole economies at the speed we need, whilst top-down approaches may not sufficiently be democratic or accountable, which is why this integrated approach is what we feel is our best shot for an energy transition that democratises as it decarbonises. So our vision incorporates the multiple levels of ownership and governance that I mentioned. So to unpack this, I'm going to share with you now some of the examples of energy projects at different scales that we have in this report. And to end, I'll share an example of the kind of nationwide public system that we could be working towards. So to begin with, I'm going to start with municipal ownership. So municipal ownership, for those who don't know, is where the local authority owns or reclaims key parts of the energy infrastructure. This might be the local grid, or it might be generating its own energy. Remunicipalism, particularly in Europe, has been a key strategy for pushing the energy transition forward and democratising energy, bringing the benefits of any revenue from energy generation or tariffs back to the public. It can provide greater citizen control and has enabled more affordable tariffs. Today, there are over 1,700 cases of remunicipalisation in 75 countries around the world. And just to emphasise the remunicipalisation is where services have been brought back into municipal control because they've been privatised in the past. So they were originally in municipal control, then privatised and then brought back. And in this database, the Public Futures database that you can see on the slide, we've also got recorded 381 cases of reclaimed or new energy services or infrastructure. And it should be noted that in the countries with the most robust examples of municipalisation or remunicipalisation, strong social movements have shaped the circumstances that have led to their existence, and consideration has been made towards enabling citizen participation. For example, in Cadiz, which has majority ownership of their main local electricity companies, their remunicipalisation strategy was accompanied by public education on the energy system, so that people could participate in decision-making around tariffs and new energy projects. In Wolfhagen, their approach to remunicipalisation was to ensure continued citizen ownership. So after they took control of their electricity grid, citizens in Wolfhagen established a municipal energy company, alongside a citizens cooperative which is represented on the municipal company's board. And this way residents have a say in how the public company is being run and how any profit should be used. And over the years, returns have been used to lower tariffs. They've almost doubled the number of staff in the energy companies. They have used them to fund local childcare, bike schemes, as well as energy system improvements. In Odisha in India, the subnational government took action to remunicipalise privatised local energy companies in 2015 after they were found to be underperforming. Odisha, which was previously Orissa, was the first state in India to privatise energy distribution in 1995, but the results, unfortunately, were a lack of investment in power infrastructure, a lack of system maintenance, and poor customer service. And in fact, this is something that we find all over the world in our studies. And so now the licenses are back in public control, which is great in terms of being able to deliver the energy transition. However, the state is having to remedy the harms of privatization, which is, of course, costly. So moving on to Kauai, in the early 2000s, the private company that ran the energy supply, distribution and transmission on the island of Kauai, which is in Hawaii, the USA, decided to sell it as it was moving on to focus on telecommunications. So local business people saw this as an opportunity, and together they formed a cooperative to buy the company. And in 2002, Kauai Island Utility Cooperative was formed, and this was owned by its members and managed by an elected board. And this not-for-profit cooperative now provides energy generation, transmission and distribution services to the whole island. And they aim to be 100% renewable by 2033. And as of 2022, they're already at 60.2% renewable energy. And before I move on, I just want to highlight the crossover here in the Kauai example and the Wolfhagen example, where they have effectively developed what we call public-public, or in this case, public-cooperative partnerships, which I'll return to a bit later on. But the development of the cooperative here was either a tool for remunicipalization or to support the municipal entities. And this can be a way of securing citizen ownership and oversight of energy companies in case of any political or policy changes. So now onto community energy. So community energy refers to energy projects run by and for communities. So they come in many different shapes and sizes, but most often we see smaller scale renewable energy generation or supply projects that aim to provide affordable tariffs or energy from renewable energy sources. And in many cases, collective decision making will be a principle from the design stage through to the running of the service or infrastructure. For example, in El Cua in Nicaragua, the community decided to develop a local hydropower project as their region was being repeatedly left out of plans for electrification. And the process to design it was characterized by regular meetings in which all community members participated, and they were designed to fit around the agricultural schedule because a lot of people in the area are agricultural workers. Local jobs were created, and the end result was so successful that they replicated the approach in surrounding villages. And one of the core components of the approach was that the tariffs would be flexible depending on what people would be able to pay, because people's income changed throughout the year. So depending on what people earned would depend on what they could pay, and this was completely flexible. And one thing about community projects is that they're often seen as being smaller scale, and this can sometimes be a criticism of them as well. So I just wanted to highlight a great example of a utility scale community energy project from America. And utility scale basically refers to the fact that the project's large enough to feed energy back into the electricity grid. So this is the Navajo Nation in America. So following a process of collective and democratic decision making, they decided to develop a large photovoltaic solar farm on their reservation land. And this was after years of their natural resources, including coal and uranium, being taken to much detrimental socio-environmental impacts. And despite these resources being on their territories, many of the population were without access to energy or having affordable energy because the resources were being taken and then fed into the grid elsewhere. And the project was carried out through collaboration with the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, their subsidiary KGI Kayenta, and the Islux Corsan, who was the contractor that would help build the plant. And this partnership ensured the project could be developed in alignment with Indigenous principles of cooperation, sustainable development, and free, prior and informed consent. And around 200 Indigenous workers were employed and given training to build and maintain the solar photovoltaic farm. And this knowledge is then being shared with future generations. And the success of the initial project led to a second phase in 2018, with the farm now having enough capacity to supply 36,000 homes. And in 2024, the project was granted long-term federal financing to support expansion, as 14,000 Navajo Nation homes were still not connected to the grid. So this case demonstrates that collective decision-making and community control can be incorporated within larger scale transitions at the regional and national levels. So cooperative level. So cooperatives can be understood as another legal structure through which community projects are operated, and they're known for a focus on worker control and decision making, but they can also enable consumer participation. So networks such as ResCube and Some Energy, which I've put on the board, are a really good place if you want to read up more about cooperatives. So ResCoop support new cooperatives to become established, and cooperatives such as Som Energia in Spain have been designed with enabling as wide-reaching participation as possible, which has resulted in its huge success. So cooperatives have been a model that have been used to roll out the energy transition for decades. And Denmark's just a key example of how they've become such leaders in producing energy from wind, which was in part instigated by community energy initiatives. So Denmark understood that by supporting community energy initiatives, they would be able to roll out the transition effectively, but also with citizen participation at the core. So by 2001, 86% of wind energy came from cooperatives. And another country that has been pioneering in this regard is the Philippines. In 1969, the Philippines government created the National Electrical Administration, which was responsible for reaching 100% electrification across the Philippines. And to achieve this, they set up electric cooperatives to supply electricity in rural areas, resulting in 119 member cooperatives today. So moving now to just briefly touch on regional energy projects. Regional energy projects might be between different geographical areas within a country, or they might be in a similar geographical area between countries. So regional energy infrastructure can look at generation, but most often we see examples in transmission. So in the United States, the Southwest Power Pool is a non-profit regional transmission organization, and it's mandated to ensure customers in the region receive reliable power, adequate transmission infrastructure, and competitively priced electricity. And they coordinate high voltage power flows spanning 14 states. And its mission is to responsibly and economically keep the lights on today and in the future. And in 2002, SPP was the first regional organisation to meet over 90% of energy demand with renewables. And it's important to kind of emphasise transmission infrastructure, because it's something that's often overlooked. But in the UK, for example, where facing all kinds of delays because the transmission infrastructure hasn't been updated, particularly the national grid. And so even though we have quite a lot of renewable energy projects being developed, some of these are waiting up to 10 years to be connected to the grid. So considering this as in part of our work on energy transitions is really important. So now moving on to the state level. So people often equate public ownership with energy projects owned and run and managed by the state, but we also highlight the coordination role that the state can play in the energy transition. So what I want to mention here is the example of Costa Rica, which really illustrates, I think, what we refer to when we're talking about system-wide public ownership, and how the state can coordinate across multiple scales of ownership to deliver effective energy transitions, but also energy systems as a whole. So for those who don't know, Costa Rica is often hailed as an example of a country that is run on almost 100% renewable energy. But what's not so often discussed is the type of energy system that Costa Rica has. Over 80% is publicly owned, and all the key infrastructure like the grid is nationally owned. And it's made up of a mixture of a national company, a couple of municipal companies, and several rural energy cooperatives. And together they generate and supply the majority of the country's energy. And they also have a public services regulatory authority, which is responsible for rate setting, which is basically the tariffs, they do this based on operating costs and energy sector investment needs, as opposed to systems with private actors where tariffs will also include profits for the shareholders. And Costa Rica's energy system structure has been essential in avoiding the energy price hikes that so many of us have experienced in recent years. So when the cost of living rates were increasing, energy costs actually went down in Costa Rica. And it's useful to note that when Costa Rica first started developing their energy system, which was largely based on the possibility for abundant hydropower, the politicians decided that energy should be a public good, which means that all people should be able to equally benefit from the use of their shared resources. And this also meant that when the National Energy Company was created, its mandate was to oppose big business and drive private capital out of the electricity industry. And this principle has underpinned people's relationship with their energy system, and why pushes to privatise large parts of their energy system since the 1990s have always been met with sustained resistance. And in fact, just picking up on this history of social struggle in Costa Rica, it's really something that has made their energy system what it is today. And it's come in several waves, but just to briefly highlight one of the waves, is the movement of people affected by dams. So around 77% of Costa Rica's energy comes from hydropower, as I mentioned. And from all accounts, people have been very proud of their energy system and happy with the infrastructure as it was. But when plans for expanding this were going to infringe on indigenous and agricultural people's rights, as well as having major impacts on biodiversity and environmental degradation, citizens began to question the decisions that were being made for their energy system. So they took action, and together they formed a coalition of community, indigenous and environmental groups and trade unions. And in 2001, together with regional and national organizations through the Federación Ecológica Nacional, they instigated a series of national forums that resulted in a proposal for a new national energy plan. And this plan centered community consultation, sustainability, and new energy technologies such as more affordable wind and solar. So basically, it was a plan to diversify the energy generation sources. And as many of you know, hydropower is also affected by climate change with water levels changing. So this was really a very insightful idea. And critically, it centered democratic decision making. And these principles were then incorporated into the Ministry of Environment and Energy's 2015 National Energy Plan. And this just demonstrates the power of coalitions, not just in resistance, but to also shift policy and government action, particularly when the plans are very concrete and clear, which is not something that we always see. So what this example really highlights is how all of these different types of ownership that I've mentioned can be coordinated to meet energy needs and to keep costs down. And it also shows how sustained social struggle can keep energy systems accountable, as well as realizing alternatives. So whilst Costa Rica is one of the few examples that has almost 100% renewable energy and such a high level of statewide coordination, some of the other examples that I've shared, such as Denmark and the Philippines, also demonstrate how important the role of the state can be in supporting different levels of ownership and democratization of energy projects, whether that's through financing or creating enabling legislation. And indeed, this coordination is essential in delivering rapid and efficient transitions. And when we learn from other successful and speedy transitions that have happened historically, such as the transition in the UK from town gas, which is from coal, to natural gas, this state coordinated effort had to transform every single household's gas appliances and expand and develop the gas grid. And all of this was completed in just 10 years, which is quite interesting when you think of now the transitions that are being discussed in terms of heating systems. And this will also need to be a kind of house by house approach. And we've been talking about it for over 20 years and we're not even close to completing. So yeah, just to highlight the possibilities when we do have this type of coordination. So what are the different ways that energy transitions that incorporate these multiple scales can be achieved? So, of course, establishing energy projects at any of the scales that we've explored is always valuable. And with the right oversight, they can be incorporated into a nationwide picture of energy service provision at any stage. And I've referred a lot to the role of state in coordination, but this, of course, depends on many factors, including the political will to deliver energy systems and the transition with that kind of coordination approach. But one mechanism that we are increasingly seeing that builds the foundations for these types of system is public-public partnerships. And these are collaborations between different public bodies. It might be a municipality with a municipality, it could be municipality and community or a cooperative project. And these initiatives basically build capacity within the public sector, as well as being able to potentially protect assets from political changes depending on the ownership model. So if something is community owned and there's a wide-reaching privatization agenda across the whole country, these community-owned assets would be protected. And they can be collaborations that share finance, they could share training or staff time or a joint ownership approach or joint project delivery. They come in many shapes and sizes. And if you're interested in this approach, one area where they've been really successful is the water sector. And on the TNI website, there's a lot of different resources about public-public partnerships and public procurement. So do check it out. So just to illustrate what I've been talking about, one example is in Plymouth in the UK. So in Plymouth in the UK, the local community had been facing a declining local economy and leaving many residents in poorly insulated housing and really high levels of energy poverty. So the local authority recognised the important role that community energy can play in simultaneously tackling energy poverty and climate change by supporting the creation of the independent Plymouth Energy Community. So the municipality allocated public funds for the establishment of the organisation and for staff time to support it. And Plymouth residents then had the autonomy to operate the organisation independently. Initially, the project focused on energy advice for vulnerable people, but as it became more successful, it expanded to deliver energy efficiency projects. And the success of that initiative then led them to be able to create Plymouth Energy Community to establish a local renewable energy project. And this project provides affordable clean energy to its members, as well as ensuring that the people that are local to the generation sites can decide how the profits are spent within their community. And I also just wanted to briefly touch upon a recent legislative change that may serve as inspiration for anyone seeking to explore policy pathways for the energy transition in line with the things that we've been discussing today. So in 2022, Honduras passed legislation to make energy a public good, which is a term that you might remember from my introduction to Costa Rica's energy system. And this means that everyone should be able to equally benefit from the shared resource of energy. And in practice, means that the Honduras government is pushing companies to prioritise energy affordability and access. And where the companies are not willing to comply, they're bringing the companies back into national ownership. So if you're not in a situation where you can just nationalize the whole of your energy system, this is a way of pushing private corporations to kind of comply with the priorities that you might have in terms of energy affordability, etc. But it's also a way of making the market less interesting for private actors to participate in. So to end, I just wanted to very briefly signpost you to some of the resources that I've mentioned, in case you want to find more examples or read more about the energy transition. So you can find a whole bunch of resources on our public powers files here. I don't know if you can see my pointy thing. And also you can see the public futures database, and I'll share the links for both of these in the chat. So that's all from me. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Rowan. This was really insightful, and thank you also for providing further resources. I think we have a couple questions. I'm just going to hand over to Victor, and then we see how it goes. And for everyone else listening, if you still have questions, don't hesitate to post them in the chat.
Yeah, so post your questions if you guys have got them, but I think I'll start with some of the ones that we have on our end. So I guess one thing that I was wondering was, what does it concretely mean for a company in Honduras, for a company to have to adhere with energy being treated as a public good? What does this kind of, what does this kind of look like for a private company or a private entity to have to be working in line with this? And then, so that's one question, and I'll just say a couple of them right now. Is that okay, Rowan, or would you prefer us to do them one at a time?
You can do a couple, and if I've forgotten, then you can remind me.
Okay. So in the case of the UK, what happens when projects have to wait 10 years to be connected to the grid? And they're not able to produce energy because they're not part of the grid. So this kind of connection to the grid time, this, how does this kind of, what kind of challenges are faced from this? And then in the Costa Rican example, do you think making energy a public good is a good first step to make energy systems more socially and environmentally just? And what are the challenges to do this? Why has this worked in Costa Rica? Why wouldn't this work in, let's say, in other countries? What kind of pushback might there be?
Okay, cool. So with the situation in Honduras, it is a situation that is kind of evolving as we speak, and I'm certainly not an expert on it, but from what I've read around it, the government kind of introduced a certain percentage of either really, really, really cheap or free energy for people that were at the lowest end of being able to afford energy. And they basically said to the energy companies that were involved in the energy system that were privately owned, you have to support these mandates And if you're not willing to comply with this type of tariff, then that gives us the right as a country to take over the companies and nationalize them. In terms of how this is playing out, I mean, obviously legislation like this takes quite a few years to kind of get going, and I'm sure that they're facing some legal pushback. But it's something that I'm kind of keeping half an eye on. So also, if anybody in the call has heard more updates, feel free to share. But then I guess that kind of links to your question, your Costa Rica question. So I mean, they did this when they first set up their energy company in the early 1900s. So that was kind of was your question? What's the benefits and what were the challenges? Sorry for that.
Yeah, so the question was kind of tacked on a bunch of things. So is this, I guess, in your experience, is this making it a public good, the kind of best way to go about ensuring that you have like a socially and environmentally just system? Like, would you say that would you kind of generalize this to the point of saying like this is almost like a prerequisite that other countries should model off of? And I guess then the question is like, what would be challenges for, let's say global North countries to kind of follow in these footsteps?
For sure. So, I mean, for me, I think that it's a really good tool. And the reason that I highlighted the Honduras example was to kind of show that whilst Costa Rica, their energy system was established with that principle, so that was right at the start of the process, Honduras have later, very recently, come in and kind of used that as a mechanism to shift the logic that's underpinning their energy system. And from my perspective, it seems like an idea that could be useful in highly liberalized or marketized systems, because you're effectively changing the mandates under which energy companies are having to run. I think that it could for sure be a way of making sure that that energy systems are socially and environmentally just. But it's not the only way. And in the Public Futures, in the report that I mentioned, Reclaiming Energy, we highlight different kinds of mandates that governments have within their system. And this might be like no mandates at all, as in many countries. But there are examples of different ways of basically forcing companies to have to deliver services to a certain standard. And I think that also this links again to the public-public partnerships, because we do see a lot. What's more common is public-private partnerships, where there's partnering with a private actor to deliver a service. And what we don't see enough of in those partnerships is very strong mandates that dictate and how the service should be provided, what percent of ownership there should be, what the tariff should be, what the profit return should be, how low that should be, and so there's I think what we're pointing towards is these types of an almost fear from policymakers or a lack of knowledge about the ways that this can be done, because otherwise private companies are much more comfortable with legislation and how they can use that to kind of get high returns, but we should also be using it in our favor to get public returns. So it's pointing towards that. And I think the challenges are that which any country faces in anywhere in the world really, is the hold that the fossil fuel industry and energy companies in general the big ones have over the policy making process. In the UK, for example, we've been polling across the political spectrum for like 5 years in favor of nationalization of energy companies. So it wouldn't be politically damaging for anybody in power, but there are many. I mean, there's more reasons than just the political will. There's also the finances and stuff like that, but there's solutions to all of those things. So the role of lobbying is probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, to really pushing through this type of legislation. You just have to have somebody come in who's really bold, who's willing to do it. But in lieu of things like that, that's why community energy projects, public-public partnerships, municipal projects, these all shift the balance of power within an energy system. So it's really useful to kind of develop projects on across the scales, that can at some point be integrated if the political window of opportunity opens. And then in terms of your question on the UK, what have been the challenges for the slow grid connection time? So that's because our model is a privatized system, and the approach to the energy transition in the UK has basically been to encourage and make easier private investment. That's had a real slowing effect on our decarbonisation, because basically investors don't want to invest because they know that it's going to take them 10 to 15 years to actually start to create a profit. So if you're following that approach and then you haven't got the appropriate infrastructure to actually enable the profits to be made, then you face a real challenge. And in fact, the government, a couple of in recent years, I can't remember exactly the date, did nationalise part of the national grid and it's called the Future Systems Operator, and this will now be in charge of carrying out the grid upgrades that are needed to hopefully facilitate a speedy energy transition.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I might have some more questions, but let's get to one of the ones in the comment first. So from Cindy, Rowan, thank you.
Cindy even has her camera on, so maybe she wants to ask the
Yeah,
question.
that if you'd like, or I can read it out if you'd like.
Victor, I was happy for you to read it out, but I'm not sure it's coherent. Thank you, Rowan. It's really, really interesting. It's also uplifting, so thank you for that. But I wanted to know, like, okay, so you have so many examples, and I'm sure more in the report, but are there places in the world that you say, hey, watch this space. This is going to go good, and this is what they need, and just a little bit more future-oriented? And then I'm just wondering about the whole political environment now. I said development aid rollback will hurt the trend, but I mean, it's just everything in general. What are you worried about? And do you have any thoughts about how to positively frame all of this so that even more far-right governments might actually be more amenable? That's a big ask. So whatever you got, thank you.
Well, I think actually it's quite interesting to watch what's happening in the US, because obviously everybody's aware of the political situation there. But because of the kind of state and federal system, there's loads of different initiatives that can take place kind of beyond the state. And there's so much happening in terms of public grid. There's a great project called Public Grids that you could check out, and the Energy Democracy Collaborative. And they're really, it's really inspiring to see what people are trying to do, on these more localized levels, despite what's happening in the big political picture. And I think for all of us, we can take inspiration from that, because we just, it's not looking great, is it, across the world? And yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out the report, because we do a whole kind of global tour of different things that are happening all over, for you to hopefully get inspired by. And yeah, what do I worry about? I mean, yeah, I'm very worried about the rise of fascism all over the world, and I think that what's quite interesting in my work especially is that we're talking a lot about the role of the state, and this seems really counter to the fact that we have a lot of distrust everywhere from all sides, from all sides of the political spectrum in the state. And I think a lot of the time people's inclination is to kind of move away from that structure because we've been let down. But I also think that this work is really about kind of reclaiming democracy and reclaiming and reimagining what the public should be, and what should we expect from these structures? Like, we all pay taxes, like what should that mean? So for me, there's quite a lot of inspiration to be had when we kind of come together and have those conversations, and hopefully that might convince people to think differently about their democratic structures. I'm not sure, but yeah, that's what I worry about, and also where I find hope at the same time.
Thank you for the answer. I guess something else that came to my mind as I've been listening to this is, what are the kind of like pathways to getting these kinds of projects off the ground, especially in places like in the European Union, where I know that because of certain debt restrictions that public entities are allowed to take on as part of being governed by the EU, that they can't always raise the funds for these types of projects to kind of collectivize existing systems or to nationalize existing systems. And so I guess what are kind of, what do you think is the most feasible way for this to happen? Is it communities to kind of start new projects that they somehow raise money for, or to collectivize existing ones? What's like the better kind of point to start thinking about this from, if we want to see change happen quickly? And also, this point that you mentioned, that community-led initiatives are good, say, protection against future privatization. Why is this the case? But in any case, I think these kinds of forms of ownership almost serve, you could think of it as like a capital control in a lot of cases, which actually keeps a lot of the profits being made in the community towards certain ends. And I think we've seen this model be very successful in different sectors like housing and water in different places. So anyways, it's very compelling. But I was curious what you had to say on those questions.
Yeah, so in terms of opportunity, so if we're thinking about Europe specifically, within the EU, and actually outside of the EU too, but within Europe, there's quite a big focus on community energy, and there's lots of different funding available. So if we're speaking specifically about community energy, either whether that's community energy in itself or community energy through a cooperative energy model, you could check out the ResCoop, who I mentioned before. And yeah, there is actually a surprising amount of funds available out there. And yeah, I won't talk through the stages in establishing a project, because all of that's available online. And other things that people keep an eye out for example, this is what happened in Wolfhagen that I mentioned earlier. The reason that they were able to remunicipalize the grid is because the contract of the company that owned the grid was coming to an end. So one thing that people can do is to keep an eye out for, map who owns your energy infrastructure, and then map when those contracts are coming to an end. And I was recently looking at this in the UK, and it's really interesting where this is and isn't, where this information is and isn't easy to find, because for energy supply and generation, it's not that easy to find, but for the grid, it's really easy to find. So that's something that can then kind of make you aware of, if you have 5 years when a contract's coming to an end, you've got 5 years to get a project together and plan and find financing, all of that kind of stuff. In terms of why community and cooperative can be a way of kind of protecting infrastructure against privatization, because if it's owned by a community or owned by a cooperative, then it's not owned by the state. The state can't just force it to privatize. But in the same way, this is also why public community or public cooperative collaborations can also be a way of protecting in the same way, because you can just ensure that even though it's sort of like maybe coordinated by the local authority or even coordinated by the state, if the ownership sits with the people, then it stays with the people. It's the same kind of approach as community land trusts, if people are interested in that kind of thing. And I think I was reading some research recently on the energy transition in Poland, and how this approach of like municipal ownership, again returning to the mandates, it was mandated that even though it was municipal ownership, it kind of remained controlled by the people. This will come out soon on the TNI website, but it's not live yet. And so when they went through these waves of privatization, as everyone did in the 90s, all of their infrastructure remained municipally owned. So I think the point about kind of what mandates and what principles we have underpinning our energy services is really important to think through. And a lot of the time it's just people don't think about that element, because you don't think that it will ever go wrong so embedding those things is really helpful, I think.
Thanks. And I don't know, it's a really interesting topic, so there's a lot of questions that come to my mind. Let's see, before I ask them, to make sure that if anybody else has a question, just make sure to type it in the chat here. But I guess one thing I'm wondering about is that there's certain regions, so like let's say the Balkans, where they're heavily reliant on coal. And there's maybe like grid isn't as expansive as in the grid isn't as expansive as in other areas. And I think one of the fears that that politicians will cite is that moving off of coal might lead to very high energy prices for people, while also, kind of making obsolete certain kind of job, like, coal industry jobs associated with the sector that pay relatively well in these areas. So I guess in your experience, have these kinds of community-led projects always kind of led to a net decrease in the cost of energy for people in the surrounding communities? Or is there some challenge in trying to, pair the renewable transition with community-led projects? Like, are there kind of like hurdles there that we need to be aware of and communities need to be aware of when trying to transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So the short answer is no, community energy doesn't always equal lower prices. And in some cases, it can even mean higher prices because you've got less people that are involved and maybe higher upfront costs, and people pay because they're happy to pay for renewables. And so there is a lot of criticisms of this type of model where, it can become exclusive and everybody can't participate. And this is actually one of the cruxes of why we talk about this need for kind of this system-wide coordination, because you need people to have this oversight about tariffs, energy affordability on a kind of governmental level that will enable the economies of scale that can reduce the prices. It is possible that community energy can lower tariffs, but it's not always the case, and that's a really important point to make. And in terms of your, sorry, I can't quite remember the full question, but in terms of the point you were making about jobs, I think again this is why it's really important for considerations about just transition. And there won't be like for like jobs just from coal to renewables. We need there to be either governments pushing private companies to do this work, or for governments to be thinking about this and delivering just transition, and that will include training and reskilling, and some people will be able to move over. I mean, there's the complications are different depending on the country, but there also needs to be other possibilities, other security for workers to ensure that a just transition can take place. I think that was all of the points that I can't remember.
That answers most of them. And I guess one final question that I had is, when we're seeing kind of like, collectivization of projects or community-led initiatives taking over the infrastructure. By infrastructure, do you mean grid or generation? Is the distinction between those two important in understanding, like, in terms of like their impact on, like, are these should we always look to do the grid and the generation of electricity? Do these go hand in hand, or is one more, if we can only do one, is one more optimal than the other? So in the example of Cadiz, for example, you said that you use the term infrastructure, and I was just curious if this meant generation and grid. And yeah, kind of some elaboration on those elements.
So I'm probably just throwing the term infrastructure around a bit haphazardly, to just use different words. But in terms of whether the grid or generation is more important, it kind of depends on the setup of the energy system. So like in the UK, we have a nationalized system, but in Germany, they have many more kind of local grids. So taking control of the grid also was really important to be able to then generate larger amounts of electricity and transport that. And yeah, so that question kind of depends on what the structure is. But if you're a community that wants to generate electricity and then use it directly, and immediately feel the impacts of the electricity, then I suppose you might want to look at generation. Yeah, it kind of depends.
Okay. And here we have a question from Joey that is, are there risks to having grids run by municipalities? Large regional utilities are able to flatten tariffs and avoid higher prices in areas that are harder to service. So in other words, it's more cost effective to maintain grids in urban areas than rural areas.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but
I think the idea is that because you might have areas where the grid is more expensive to maintain because of a lower density of population or whatever it might be, vis-a-vis, more densely populated urban spaces, that having a grid be owned and like having, I guess, all the infrastructure be nationalized, so like I guess less decentralized and more centralized, you can kind of even out price differences between the areas where maintaining the grid might be very expensive because of the low density of people in the area versus the places where it's cheaper because of the high density of people in the area. So in a way, that's, I guess, an argument to have as regional or national of a level of ownership as possible to kind of flatten these differences. If I
yeah,
understand that correctly, Joey, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. I work for a utility and we have a table of rates, and our rates are higher in different areas, but everyone in the province pays the same tariff to access electricity and to access gas.
yeah, and that's coordinated by the state, or who's it coordinated?
Where I live, gas is private, but electricity is public.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like you've answered your own question here, because yeah, that there are risks, and I think there are risks on kind of any of these scales where we're talking about something being provided for one group of people and not for another, whether that's municipal or community or anything, which is why we argue for this sort of state-led coordination. But you could also see municipal to municipal kind of cooperation where you would try to support for equitable tariffs across different regions if you didn't have a kind of a mandate within the state to do that kind of thing by itself. So I think there are many different ways that we could imagine that that cooperation could happen to ensure this flattening of tariffs. But yeah, I think there's always risks, unfortunately.
Are there any examples of like a bottom up where you have municipal-led cooperatives and then they coordinate in some sort of like transmission superstructure between them? Or is that always done by like a large state-led actor?
For transmission, I'm not sure, but that's quite interesting. I would be happy to ask around in the office, and I could get back to you if you want to share your email.
Sure.
Cool. Okay, well, we're at the bottom of the hour here, or top of the hour. I'm never sure what part of the hour we're at, but we're almost at 7 o'clock Central Time here, or Central European Time here. So if there's no other questions, I think we should probably wrap it up and give Rowan a big thank you for an excellent presentation and for answering our questions.
Yeah, thank you, Victor, for taking care of the question section. I will just say a couple of things maybe for the Austrian context and doing a little outro. And yes, thank you so much, Rowan, for answering all our questions. So yeah, I think you really nicely pointed to like the different sort of solutions that we can have if we think about energy futures in a more democratic and participatory way. And I think you also, like the last question, really put it together for me. So we also need like different levels, like not just one level of how we have to transform the energy system, but really think through all the levels from like regional, municipal, and national. And I think only if these levels work together, we will be able to have a energy transition that's actually just in a lot of ways. So yeah, thank you so much. And I think this is also why we as Attack Austria, of course, call for a democratic energy system and are also pointing towards different solutions. So thank you for sharing the international solutions. If you're more interested in national context and the Austrian context, then feel free to contact us, visit our website, follow us on social media. And yes, thank you so much. And I will stop the recording now. Have a nice evening.